February 2016 California bar exam. The essay drops a fact pattern about a guy who shoves his neighbor, grabs her dog, locks her in a room, and sends threatening letters. The question asks what intentional torts apply. Students who had their elements cold wrote clean, organized IRAC. Students who blurred the elements together wrote mush. The difference wasn't how smart they were. It was whether they had the doctrine map locked in before they sat down. Are you ready for this? Because I am. That's what this video is about. Torts feels overwhelming because the structure comes last, if it comes at all. 7 foundational frameworks, and the California bar tests them over and over. But once you see all 7 and how they connect, torts stops being a pile of random rules and starts being something you can work through under pressure. Torts gets tested roughly once every year and a half on the California bar essay section, and it's one of the most heavily tested subjects on the MBE. It shows up solo, combined with remedies, combined with civil procedure, and buried inside real property questions as nuisance. The July 2014 essay combined negligence, premises liability, negligence per se, and vicarious liability all in one fact pattern. Design defect products liability has its own recurring slot. You need to know the whole thing. Stop overcomplicating it, just do this instead. The students who bomb torts essays almost always know the rules. They can recite Battery's elements, they know comparative fault reduces damages, they've heard of res ipsa. But knowing when each rule activates and how the frameworks connect to each other is what separates passing essays from failing ones. They'll spend 3 paragraphs analyzing whether a defendant was negligent, when the correct analysis is strict products liability, no negligence required. They'll discuss comparative fault in an intentional tort scenario where it doesn't apply as a complete defense. Structure is the exam skill, not the rules. Rules are just the raw material. Draw this on your scratch paper at the start of every torts essay. Torts liability runs on 3 parallel tracks. Intentional torts require purpose or knowledge to a substantial certainty that the tortious result would follow. For negligence, ask whether the defendant's conduct fell below the standard of a reasonable person. Strict liability attaches based on the dangerous activity or defective product alone, which makes the defendant's intent and level of care beside the point. These 3 tracks are mutually exclusive in theory, but they can all show up in the same fact pattern. Picture a driver who runs a red light while hauling chemicals. That's potentially strict liability for an abnormally dangerous activity, negligence for the driving itself, and possibly battery if the contact was intentional. Before writing a single word of analysis, identify which track is live for each defendant-plaintiff pair, because if you get the track wrong, your whole answer is off-key. Okay, here we go. This is the fun part. Within those 3 tracks, here are the 7 areas you need to cover. First, the 3 tracks overview, including how intent transfers. Second, intentional torts, battery, assault, false imprisonment, IIED, trespass to land, trespass to chattels, conversion. Third, negligence with the full DBCD checklist. Fourth, negligence defenses, including pure comparative fault in California. Fifth, strict liability, including wild animals, abnormally dangerous activities, and products liability with its 3 defect types. Sixth, damages, compensatory, punitive, and nominal. 7th, key doctrines, eggshell plaintiff joint, and several liability under Prop 51, respondent superior, collateral source rule, and res ipsa loquitur. That's the map, so now let's go through every room. Starting with intentional torts. For every one of them, the core structure is the same. Act, intent, the specific harmful result that tort defines, and causation. What changes is that specific harmful result. The intent requirement is the piece people get wrong most often. You need either specific intent, the actual desire to produce the forbidden result, or general intent, meaning you acted with knowledge to a substantial certainty that the result would occur. Motive is completely irrelevant, so a surgeon who performs an operation the patient didn't consent to has committed battery, even if the surgery saved the patient's life. And this is the key part right here. Before going through each intentional tort, you need to understand transferred intent. It applies to exactly 5 torts: assault, battery, false imprisonment, trespass to land, and trespass to chattels. If D throws a rock intending to hit person A, but hits person B instead, the intent transfers, and it also transfers across torts. So if D intends assault but commits battery, the intent still counts. IIED and conversion are explicitly excluded from transferred intent, so mark that. If D intends to batter A, misses, and causes B severe emotional distress, there is no transferred intent to IIED. Battery. D acts with intent to cause harmful or offensive contact with P's person, and that contact results. Offensive means contact a person of ordinary sensitivity wouldn't permit, and physical injury isn't required. Anything P is holding or carrying counts as P's person. So if you yank someone's purse off their shoulder, that's battery. Indirect contact counts too. Battery doesn't require P to be aware of the contact when it happens, which means you can commit battery on an unconscious patient. Assault. D acts by overt physical conduct to create in P a reasonable apprehension of an immediate battery. P must be aware of the threatened contact. Apprehension means awareness of the imminent contact, not fear. A 300-pound fighter who isn't scared by a threat can still be assaulted. Use P's perspective. Words alone don't constitute assault because there has to be an overt act. Conditional threats can negate immediacy, but a conditional threat D has no right to impose, like raising a fist and saying your money or your life is sufficient. The unloaded gun problem. If P reasonably believed the gun was loaded, assault is satisfied. False imprisonment, D acts with intent to confine P to a bounded area, and P is thereby confined. Confinement can come from physical barriers, physical force, threats of force, or invalid assertion of legal authority. The bounded area must be complete, so keeping someone out isn't false imprisonment. There must be no reasonable means of escape known to or reasonably discoverable by P. P must be aware of the confinement or suffer actual harm. Duration doesn't matter. Even 10 minutes qualifies if the other elements are met. The shopkeeper's privilege is a complete defense. A merchant who reasonably believes theft occurred may detain someone for a reasonable time and in a reasonable manner to investigate. This is the real stuff right here. With IEED, the conduct must be extreme and outrageous. It has to exceed all bounds of decency tolerated in a civilized society, so mere insults and rude behavior don't qualify. Factors that push conduct toward outrageous include continuous repetitive bad behavior, D being a common carrier or innkeeper where words alone can be sufficient, and P being a member of a fragile class, children, elderly, pregnant women, or adults whose known sensitivities D is deliberately exploiting. The distress must be severe, not just momentary upset. And again, transferred intent doesn't apply to IIED, which makes it the most frequently tested trap in this area. Trespass to land. D intentionally enters P's land or causes a physical thing to enter without permission. The intent required is only the intent to enter that particular piece of land, so D doesn't have to know the land belongs to someone else, and a good faith mistake about ownership isn't a defense. Entry can be below the surface or above it at a low enough altitude to interfere with P's use. Nominal damages are available even without actual harm, because the invasion of the property right itself is the tort. Trespass to chattels and conversion both involve interference with P's possessory interest in personal property, separated by degree. Trespass to chattels is when D intentionally interferes with P's use or possession of a chattel, causing actual damage, and the remedy is actual damages or rental value for the lost use. Conversion is when D exercises dominion and control over P's chattel so extensively that D should be required to pay its full fair market value. D has effectively forced a sale. A quick joyride in P's car is trespass to chattels, but strip the car for parts and sell them, and that's conversion. The remedy for conversion is full fair market value at the time of the conversion. Okay, so building on that, now negligence. This is the most heavily tested framework on both the California Bar and the MBE. The mnemonic is DBCD. Duty, breach, causation, damages, all four are required, so miss one and P loses. Your IRAC should hit all four in order, every single time. Duty in California means D owes a duty of care to all foreseeable plaintiffs. The general standard is reasonable person of ordinary prudence under the same or similar circumstances. Modifications. Professionals like doctors and lawyers are held to the standard of their profession in a similar community. Children are held to the standard of a child of similar age, education, intelligence, and experience, unless they're engaged in adult activities like driving a car, in which case the adult reasonable person standard applies. California abolished the invitee licensee distinction for landowners under Rowland versus Christian in 1968, so landowners owe a duty of reasonable care to all entrants based on foreseeability. Trespassers still get limited duty, but with the attractive nuisance doctrine protecting child trespassers. And nobody's going to tell you this except me. Breach is where D failed to act as a reasonable person would. Evidence of breach includes industry custom, violation of a statute, and res ipsa loquitur. The negligence per se rule in California. In California, if a statute was designed to protect people in P's class from the type of harm that occurred, violation of that statute creates a rebuttable presumption of negligence. And that rule comes up in exam fact patterns constantly. Causation has two components. Actual cause uses the but for test. But for D's negligence, would the harm have occurred? California also uses the substantial factor test when multiple sufficient causes exist, and either one alone would have caused the harm. Proximate cause is the foreseeability analysis. D is liable for all foreseeable consequences of the negligent act. The eggshell plaintiff rule means D takes P as found. So if P has a pre-existing condition that makes the injury worse, D is still liable for the full extent. And superseding intervening causes can cut off D's liability if they're unforeseeable. Criminal acts of third parties are typically unforeseeable superseding causes, unless D's negligence created the very risk that the crime exploited. Okay, here's the next layer of this. California uses pure comparative fault, which means P can be 99% at fault and still recover 1% of damages from D, and P's recovery is reduced by fault percentage, nothing more. Implied primary assumption of risk, where P voluntarily entered a situation with an inherent risk D didn't create or increase, can be a complete bar to recovery. Implied secondary assumption of risk, where P knowingly encountered a risk D negligently created, folds into comparative fault and reduces recovery. Primary versus secondary assumption of risk shows up on the exam. Strict liability covers three main categories. First, Wild animals. Owners are strictly liable for harm caused by wild animals, regardless of the owner's knowledge of the specific animal's dangerous propensities. Second, abnormally dangerous activities. Courts use factors like whether the activity creates a high degree of risk, whether the risk can't be eliminated by reasonable care, whether the activity is uncommon in the community, and whether the location is appropriate. Third, products liability with its three defect types: manufacturing defect, design defect, and failure to warn. A manufacturing defect is when the specific product deviated from the intended design. A design defect can be analyzed under the Consumer Expectations Test or the Risk Utility Test in California. And failure to warn is when the product needed instructions or warnings that weren't provided. On damages, compensatory damages split into special damages, meaning economic losses like medical bills and lost wages that can be calculated with specificity, and general damages, meaning pain and suffering and emotional distress. Punitive damages require proof of malice, oppression, or fraud in California, so negligence alone doesn't support punitives. Nominal damages are available in intentional torts even with no actual harm proven. The collateral source rule means D can't reduce damages because P received compensation from insurance or another third-party source, so D doesn't get credit for that. I'm still blown away by this, honestly. Two doctrines that come up constantly and get mishandled: res ipsa loquitur and Prop 51. Res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. P can use this to infer negligence when the accident is of a type that normally doesn't happen without negligence. The instrumentality was in D's exclusive control, and P didn't contribute to the accident, which gets P to the jury without direct evidence of how D was negligent. Under Prop 51 in California, joint and several liability was modified. Defendants are jointly and severally liable only for economic damages, but for non-economic damages, each defendant is liable only for their proportionate share of fault. That's a California-specific rule that changes the outcome significantly when you have multiple defendants. And respondent superior. An employer is vicariously liable for the torts of an employee committed within the scope of employment. Frolic versus detour. A minor deviation from assigned work is a detour, so the employer is still liable. But a major departure for personal reasons is a frolic, which means the employer isn't. Independent contractors generally don't trigger respondent superior, but there are exceptions for inherently dangerous activities and non-delegable duties. I didn't learn this in school, I learned it by doing. If you ever need to find someone or run a background check, go to Scraper City. If you want to grow your law firm using outbound techniques where legally allowed, check out Galadon Gold. And to automatically grow on Twitter and X, use Tweetloft. The next video is coming up now.